Hey Rick, how's your day going?
It's good. How's your day going?
It's been busy, but it's been good. Eager for you to sit behind this desk and take some of that. So it'd be good. Yeah, Rick, we've known each other a long time, and I really want people to get to know you like I have gotten to know you over time. And I just thought we'd take a few minutes and just ask you to kind of tell us a little bit about your past, like where'd you grow up and
Yeah.
why'd you want to be a doctor and where'd you get your training and stuff like that.
Yeah, I grew up in New Orleans. Prior to that, my dad was in the U.S. Army, and then he went to the VA hospital system. So actually, I lived in eight or more places, I think, in the first 10 years of my life, which was a lot. My dad went to Vietnam during that time. And in any case, we settled in New Orleans when I was 11 years old, and I went to middle school and high school there. Went back to New Orleans after spending 4 years at TCU for undergraduate. I went to medical school in New Orleans at LSU New Orleans. And big foundational part of who I am growing up in that culture, which is Southern and European and Catholic and just all kinds of stuff. But I've really lived in Memphis now since 1990. So I've really transplanted there and have lived there significantly longer than I lived in New Orleans. So I kind of joke around. I've either lived at the top or the bottom of the Mississippi Delta all my life. And both places it's hot and flat and
Yeah.
a lot of people struggling to make a good living in those places.
Sure.
So
Was your dad medical?
my dad was a hospital administrator. He had a master's in health or hospital administration and worked in the VA system. His time in Vietnam, he worked at a South Vietnamese hospital as a U.S. Army advisor to the South Vietnamese Army in their medical corps.
Yeah. Was that an influence for you to want to be a doctor?
Probably not. My mom was a nurse, and from an era where she started out as one of the nurses, like in your memory, I can remember her wearing the white cap and going to work the 3 to 11 shift and white nurse's skirt, and that would have been the late 60s, and she rode the wave of nursing education. She went got a bachelor's degree from her diploma status, and then she got a master's degree, and she became even a professor. She got a doctorate eventually, and so she actually gave me my diploma at my med school graduation because she was a faculty member in the School of Nursing and was on stage at graduation. So maybe she was a little more influential than my dad was.
Yeah. And you went to LSU med school?
I did. In New Orleans, there's two, one in Shreveport, one in New Orleans.
Mm-hmm.
And really enjoyed medical school a lot.
Yeah. Do you mind me asking, you had a bout with cancer when you were at a critical kind of point in your life. You talk about that for a second?
I was at Christmas break of my sophomore year in college. I was a student, as I mentioned, at TCU, but I was back in New Orleans for the holidays, and I went to a conference of Christian college students. And instead of going back to Fort Worth and going with TCU kids, I just went an hour north to Baton Rouge, and I went with LSU kids, even though I wasn't an undergraduate there. And we got on 5 buses, and we went for Kansas City. The conference was in Kansas City. This was 1983. There was an ice storm. We almost didn't go, but we went. And then on the first day after we left, we slid off. The bus I was in, one of the 5 buses in our caravan, slid off an icy road and collided with a parked semi, and I got thrown a little bit and went to a local ER in some Arkansas town. I don't even remember where it was. Me and a handful of other students. I got x-rays done to make sure I hadn't fractured any ribs, and there was a big shadow, a big mass in my chest, in my what we call the mediastinum, the middle of my chest. So went to the conference after some ER doctor, told me, hey, this doesn't look good, gave me a copy actually of the x-rays and said, when you get home, you need to get this checked out. And I mentioned that my dad was a hospital administrator, so I pretty quickly got a CAT scan. And by the next day. I was at Ochsner Hospital, had a biopsy, and yeah, I had a malignant tumor that was extending. I don't know if you can see my scar here, but it goes from here to here, and got my chest cracked and long procedure, oncology consults. And so, anyway, that's a long story, but recovered from that mostly through a surgical cure, and but missed some time, had to sit out a semester, and that confirmed me. I was already a pre-med at that point, but that kind of locked me in, all of the experiences I had with
Yeah.
multiple surgeries and recovery, and yeah.
And from that experience, you decided you didn't want to be a surgeon.
Well,
No, it's a great story, and it's a story I think that's very formative in your life, and one that probably most people don't know. But it's God's delivered you because it was malignant. It was a pretty dangerous deal, and was that formative in your faith?
yeah, it was. And let me say, like, the tissue diagnosis was obscure. Like, I was scheduled to start chemotherapy. They really weren't sure. They sent that to the U.S. Military hospital for further evaluation, and it ended up being what's called a schwannoma, which is usually not malignant. Schwann cells line our nerve cells, and they help our nerves conduct impulses faster. It was just really large, compressing my airway, a bunch of structures in my neck. And but in answer to your question, weirdly enough, the year before, when I was a freshman college student, 18 years old, and I was a brand new Christian, I'd only converted from a cultural pseudo-Catholic life that I had before that. My parents were faithful Catholics. They were serious about it, but I wasn't a faithful Catholic. But I had a dramatic conversion at age 17. And when I was 18, freshman at TCU, I led some other knuckleheads into sneaking into the Amon Carter Stadium, the big football stadium at TCU, where there was cool AstroTurf, and we would play football on the turf by moonlight because we were idiots. And one night I broke my arm, terrible fracture, what's called a supracondylar fracture, and had to go and have surgery for multiple hours, and had weeks of recovery and physical therapy. And for a young believer who hadn't had any kind of pain like that before, probably weirdly enough, breaking my arm and having surgery and recovering from that shook me up more than the tumor did a year later, just because of coming to terms with pain and wondering about, was this my fault? I never had the sense to say, hey, maybe you shouldn't sneak into football stadiums in the middle of the night and play football. I didn't think clearly like that. But in any case, that focused me into what am I in college for? What am I here for? What does God call me for? And that's when I sort of switched from, hey, I think I'm a sociology major, to let's go chemistry and try to get into medical school and see what happens. So the next year at Christmas time was the bus accident and the whole bigger deal. But I think that I really learned more and wrestled with things more when I broke my arm the year before.
Yeah. So you came to Memphis to do residency, right? And there's legend about really just you and your LSU classmates taking a blood pact in an anatomy lab. And but like that was a commitment to really walk out and live out the gospel, right? Through what you're doing, what you would do. Can you just give it a real quick kind of overview of kind of coming to Memphis and then what you're doing now and getting ready to come into here?
Yeah, I've made the story taller as years have gone by, so I don't really remember exactly what happened. But there was a small CMDA group, and we were part of it, and we were committed to each other. We met weekly. That included our time as third and fourth years, where some of us traveled outside of New Orleans. We would meet sometimes in a neutral city even. So our commitment was to work together when we finished. And I think the most remarkable part of it is that we all graduated in 1990. We all left New Orleans. We weren't with each other anymore. Steve Besh went to University of Alabama at Birmingham. David Pepperman to Tuscaloosa to do family medicine. Karen Miller went to Emory in Atlanta for OBGYN, and I went to Memphis for combined internal medicine peds. And so if you can think about being 26 years old at the time of life when you're planning what you're going to do and where you're going to live, and I think 2 or 3 of us got married during that time, and to still talk to each other as we're in training and as we're wrapping it up, begin to work towards what we're going to do to fulfill that promise we made to each other when we were just first-year students. So I was in Memphis, as I mentioned. We looked at several places. We went back to New Orleans, looked for opportunities. We looked at some places in rural Alabama, but we settled on Shelby County because we went to a big recruitment fair for underserved areas in Tennessee, and Shelby County had overwhelmingly the biggest number of people lacking primary care, big concentration of low-income people without health access compared to, and there were 4 of us. So there were a lot of counties in Tennessee that needed a doctor or two, but 4 was an interesting thing. I hadn't seen that before.
Yeah.
So we settled on Memphis. We settled on southwestern part of Memphis where there was a big need. And we opened our first health center after a lot more stumbling in 1995.
Well, listen, I want to keep this short. There's going to be plenty of time for you to fill in the blanks, over the years to come. But I appreciate your time.